It's absolutely ridiculous, blind, to make the assumption that the hierarchies in functioning Western democracies are fundamentally predicated on power and tyranny. And then, you know, I can use a biological example too, which would place me outside of the postmodern realm of argument, because the postmodernists don't believe in biology, but they act like they do because they all die. So, this primatologist named, well, I'll tell you two stories, okay, because these are really useful. So the one's about rats, and I got this story from Jaak Panksepp, who is a great neuroscientist. He wrote a book called Affective Neuroscience, which, by the way, is on my reading list. That's on my website. It's a really good book, Affective Neuroscience. He's a great scientist. He was one of the people who he learned that rats laugh. They laugh ultrasonically like bats. So if you tickle them with a pencil eraser, they laugh, but you have to record it and then slow it down, and then you can hear them. And you might think, well, rats laugh. Like, what would you get a grant for that? What kind of idiocy is that? It's like, no. Just don't get ahead of yourself here. You know, he was showing that capacity for social interaction, that was mediated by physiological touch, activated the same. Excuse me. Activated the same circuits in rats that it does in people, and that those are actual biological circuits, and that we share them even with rats. Now, rats are quite similar to human beings, as it turns out. I could say especially postmodernists, but I won't. and so the fact that little rats giggle when you tickle them is actually extraordinarily important. He also identified. Surprising, I've been talking too much lately. He also identified the primary play circuit in mammals. And that's a big deal too from a scientific perspective. That's like discovering a new continent, like discovering a whole brain system that people really didn't know existed. That's a big deal. So here's a little story about rats. So young rats like to engage in rough and tumble play, especially juvenile males. It's also the case for puppies, if you've ever had a puppy. Dogs are like that. They like to wrestle. And it's one of the things that male human beings tend to do with their offspring, and it's a really, really good thing. Like, rough and tumble play with children really helps socialize them, because it helps them figure out the difference between touch, and even rough touch, and pain. You know, because one of the things you're doing when you're rough and tumble playing with a little kid is, you know, you throw them up in the air and you wrestle them around. I had 2 couches when my kids were little that were sort of face to face. So we built this little wrestling ring, and I used to go in there and pound them half to death every night, you know. So they love that. I mean, they get so excited about that. They love that so much. It's just crazy. But the reason for that is, like, you're stretching out their bodies, and you're showing them that they can't put their thumb in your eye, and you're teaching them to be graceful, and you're teaching them the difference between something new that's happening to the body and something painful. You're really teaching them to dance. And it's this really complicated physiological dance that is indicative of a socialized being. And that's partly why women like men who can dance, by the way, because it shows that you can pay attention to someone else. First of all, that you're coordinated, but even more importantly, that you can take the fact of your coordination and coordinate that with someone else's coordination. So, and that's very primal and physiological. It's built right into your body. And rough and tumble play helps with that a lot. Anyways, rats also like to rough and tumble play for much the same reasons, and so do pretty much all social mammals. So you can tell that rats like it. See, how do you know if a rat likes something? Well, he'll work for it. And one of the ways you can figure out if a rat wants to work for something is that, you know, you get him in a state where maybe he's desperate for whatever he's working for, and you can put a little spring on him and figure out how hard he pulls to go somewhere he knows where he's going to get that. And then you can measure the force that he's willing to apply, and that gives you a rough estimate of his motivation. Or maybe he has to bar press like a cocaine-addicted rat to receive the reward, and you can count rate of bar pressing, and you can get an estimate of how excited the rat is to go do whatever it is the rat's going to do. And so Panksepp used to put rats, he'd pair them, one rat against the other, in kind of a play arena, not a very big thing. And these were juvenile males, and they would work to do that. Okay, so they liked it. And then maybe one rat was 10% bigger than the other. And then when you paired them, the big rat would beat the little rat because 10% weight advantage was enough to make the bigger rat dominant. Okay, so then they established basically dominance and submission. You might think about that as a power relationship, and to some degree it is, but it's more complicated than that, and this is very important. So the rats play together once, and the big rat pins the little rat, really very much like wrestling. Like rats wrestle, just like people wrestle. And if you pair them together, then the big rat can pin the little rat. Okay, so now you got dominant rat, subordinate rat, roughly speaking. But then, you see, if you stop the experiment there, you'd think, well, the rats play to establish dominance and submission. But the thing is that rats don't just play once, they play many, many, many times. And that's also the case with human beings, is that you don't just play once, you play many, many times. And there's a difference between the rules of a game and the rules of a set of games. And that's so unbelievably important, so you keep that in mind, because we'll return to that. So anyways, the next time the two rats get together, the little rat has to ask the big rat to play, because the rule basically is subordinate entity asks dominant entity to play. And so the little rat does what mammals do to play. You know, they kind of put their paws down and put their rear end bit up in the air. You see dogs do that, and unless you're completely clueless, you know that that doesn't mean he's going for your throat. It means he wants you to whack him on the side of the head so he can sort of pretend to bite you, you know. It's pretty obvious if you've played with dogs and children. So, and I make that comparison because dogs and children understand each other, right? They're pack animals. They follow the same basic rules. They know how to play. They can become friends. Otherwise, you wouldn't have them as pets. I mean the dogs, not the children. So anyways, the little rat asks the big rat to play. And the big rat thinks, yeah, okay, we'll play. They wrestle. And you pair them multiple times. Well, if you pair them multiple times, what you find is that unless the big rat lets the little rat win 30% of the time, the little rat won't ask the big rat to play anymore. And that you think, well, who cares? Why is that important? It's like, it's really important. That's a really important discovery, because it shows you that even rats have a sense of fair play that emerges across iterated games. It's evidence for the biological instantiation of a social morality. It's a big deal, man. That's a big discovery. And it shows you that even at the level of rats, they're very social animals, by the way. The interactions between rats are mediated by something like a sense of fairness or justice. And so that's extremely cool, because you know, we tend to think of animals as having dominance hierarchies, and that's predicated on power. And that idea, even though the bloody postmodernists don't believe in biology, they extend that analogy up to human beings. It's just not true. Okay, well, the same turns out to be true of chimpanzees. So Frans de Waal, who's a Dutch primatologist, a very smart one too, he's been interested in the biological basis of morality as well. And he's written a lot of good books on primate behavior, chimps in particular. Chimps are brutal creatures, man. Like, they go to war, eh? And so if you have a chimp territory out in the jungle, then the juveniles will, the males in particular, they'll band together in groups of 4 or 5. There's often, but not always, a female or 2 with them. And if they come across chimps from another troop that aren't within their hierarchy, let's say, they will, if they outnumber them, because they can't really count, but they can estimate magnitude visually. It's not the same as counting. But if they outnumber them, they will tear them to pieces. And chimps are at least twice as strong as a really well-developed human male. And so they can tear you up pretty good. And chimps are perfectly capable. They hunt. They're carnivorous, like human beings. And they hunt colobus monkeys often. They weigh about 40 pounds. And they'll basically eat them alive. Right? The monkey's screaming away like mad because, you know, it's in pain because it's being eaten. And that doesn't slow the chimps down a bit. There's no cross-species empathy stopping them from having their snack. And so chimps are very brutal creatures. And it isn't obvious they have a lot of internal inhibition of their aggression at all. Most of the inhibition is sociological. It's out in the hierarchy. And so the reason chimps aren't always aggressive with one another is because they know who can pound them and who will gang up on them and who won't. They establish their hierarchy. Anyways, you know, you think about a chimp hierarchy and you're talking about a fairly strong and aggressive creature. You might think it's biggest, ugliest, meanest, most vicious, irritable, unpleasant chimp that rises to the top. Well, that's kind of the postmodernist view of human society. But that's not the case. It happens sometimes. But what happens, and de Waal has documented this quite nicely, is that tyrant chimps lead unstable regimes. Now, you know, that might sound familiar, because the same thing, of course, is true of human beings. And why is that? Well, it's because, you know, people don't like tyrants, and chimps don't like them that much either. And chimps are actually quite reciprocal in their social interactions. So they don't just dominate each other, they groom each other, they have friendships, they contract social relationships over very long periods of time. You know, and they do that. And so they engage in reciprocal interactions, let's say pro-social reciprocal interactions. And you might think, well, what's the weak point of the biggest, ugliest, toughest chimp in the troop? And that is, he doesn't have any friends. And so, you know, maybe he has a bad day. He's a little hungover or whatever from eating fermented bananas or whatever he is partying with. And two of the slightly less ugly, slightly less mean chimps decide, well, this is a good time to take him out, and they tear him to pieces. And so one of the things de Waal has pointed out quite nicely is that if you want to have a stable chimp dominance hierarchy, let's call it a regime, the stable ones aren't ruled by the tyrants, because the tyrants get taken out by paired up friendship dyads, something like that. So that's really worth thinking about too, you know, because it indicates that even in creatures that have less complex sociological orders, and they do, because one of the things that predicts how complex your social order is how big your brain is compared to your body. It's encephalization, essentially. And the more encephalized a creature, the larger the social groups it can track. And of course, human beings are very highly encephalized, so we have quite complicated group organizations. But even in simpler group organizations like the chimps, it isn't the tyrant who rules stably. And that turns out to be also incredibly important. Okay, so, you know, so much for the idea that power is the only game in town.